When a child was born in prehistoric Africa 100,000 years ago, the group gathered. They had no ultrasound, no gender reveal, no months of preparation for a specific outcome. They had a birth, and then they had a child, and then something happened that the archaeological and anthropological record has only recently begun to reveal in detail. Something that will probably surprise you. Because the assumption most people carry, that son preference is ancient, universal, and natural, that humans have always valued male children more than female ones, is not supported by the evidence from the period when most of human evolution actually happened. The data from hunter-gatherer societies, from prehistoric burial sites, and from comparative anthropology points in a different direction entirely. For most of human evolutionary history, a daughter may have been worth more to the group than a son. Not because of sentiment, because of strategy. The conventional assumption is that son preference is universal and ancient. Boys carry the family name, boys provide physical labor, boys defend territory, boys inherit and transmit wealth. Son preference, the story goes, is wired into human nature by evolution itself. This story collapses when you look at the actual evidence from the societies that most closely resemble those in which human evolution occurred. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer HRDY, whose work on human cooperative breeding has transformed evolutionary anthropology, spent decades studying sex preferences and birth outcomes across traditional societies. Her finding is consistent and counterintuitive. In mobile hunter-gatherer bands, the social structure that characterized human life for roughly 95% of our evolutionary history, daughters were more consistently valued than sons. Not universally, not without exception, but as a pattern across multiple unrelated traditional societies, the birth of a daughter generated social responses that differed from the birth of a son in ways that the evidence suggests were not arbitrary. To understand why, you need to understand how hunter-gatherer alliance networks work. In a mobile band of 30 to 50 people, survival depends on the maintenance of social relationships with neighboring bands. Access to water sources, hunting territories, and food resources during scarce periods depends on reciprocal obligations between groups. These obligations are built and maintained through exchange, including the exchange of people. When a daughter is born into a hunter-gatherer band, she represents a future alliance. When she reaches adulthood and pairs with a man from a neighboring band, she creates a permanent social connection between the two groups. Her children become kin to both bands. Her presence in the neighboring band becomes a bridge, a source of information, hospitality, and mutual obligation in both directions. In a social system where alliances with neighboring groups are a primary survival mechanism, a daughter is not just a child, she is a future diplomatic relationship. A son in the same system stays closer to home. The most direct archaeological evidence for how prehistoric societies valued children of different sexes comes from burial sites, specifically from the grave goods placed with children who died before reaching adulthood. Burial goods reflect investment. The objects placed with a child at death represent what the group believed that child was worth, what they wanted to send with them, what their loss meant to the community. Disparities in burial goods between male and female children would be the clearest possible signal of differential valuation. What researchers find in Paleolithic and early Mesolithic burial sites, the periods closest to the hunter-gatherer baseline, is striking for its absence of disparity. Studies of Upper Paleolithic burials across Europe, dating from approximately 10,000 to 40,000 years ago, consistently find that children of both sexes receive comparable burial treatment. The Sungir burials in Russia, the extraordinary site where two children were buried with approximately 10,000 ivory beads each, include one burial identified as male and one as female. The investment was essentially equal. Bioarchaeologist Jane Buekstra's systematic analysis of archaic period North American burial sites found no statistically significant differences in grave good quantity or quality between male and female children. The pattern held across multiple sites spanning thousands of years. This is not proof that prehistoric people felt identically about sons and daughters. Emotional experience leaves no archaeological trace. But it is evidence that the differential investment in male versus female children, the material expression of preference, was not a feature of the social systems that characterized most of human evolutionary history. The disparity appears later. and it appears with striking consistency at a specific moment in the archaeological record. When agriculture begins. At Neolithic and Bronze Age sites across Europe and Asia, sites dating to after the agricultural transition, researchers begin finding systematic differences in burial treatment between male and female children. Boys receive more grave goods, boys receive more elaborate burials. The material record of son preference emerges in the archaeological record in direct association with the shift to settled agriculture. The preference was not ancient, it was invented. To understand why the agricultural transition created son preference where hunter-gatherer societies showed relative equality, you need to understand what agriculture changed about the value of children. In a hunter-gatherer band, a child's value to the group is primarily social and relational. Children become hunters, gatherers, caregivers, alliance partners, knowledge carriers. The contributions are relatively similar across sexes, with daughters providing the specific additional value of external alliance creation. Agriculture changed this in 3 specific ways that directly affected the relative value of sons and daughters. First, land. Agricultural societies accumulate property, specifically land. Land is heritable, and in the earliest agricultural societies, land inheritance followed the male line. Sons inherited. Daughters who left to join their husband's family did not. In a system where accumulated land is the primary form of wealth and sons are the inheritors, a son's birth represents the continuation of the family's economic position. A daughter's birth represents an economic cost, the dowry required to secure her marriage into another family. Second, labor. Agricultural work, field preparation, plowing, harvest, is labor-intensive and benefits from physical strength applied over sustained periods. In pre-mechanized agriculture, male physical strength was a genuine productive advantage. Sons represented future agricultural labor on the family's own land. Daughters represented labor that would eventually be transferred to another family. Third, paternity certainty. In settled agricultural societies, property inheritance required certainty about biological paternity. You needed to know that your sons were actually your sons before leaving your land to them. This created social structures that controlled female sexuality and movement in ways that had no precedent in mobile hunter-gatherer bands where property did not exist to inherit. In this new social system, daughters became associated with uncertainty and cost. Sons became associated with continuity and investment return. Anthropologist Laura Betzig's cross-cultural analysis of historical societies found that son preference correlates strongly with the degree of wealth inequality and property inheritance through the male line, not with any deep feature of human psychology. The preference is not evolutionary, it is economic, and the economy that produced it was invented approximately 10,000 years ago. The most compelling evidence that son preference is not an ancient evolved preference but a cultural response to economic conditions comes from modern data. If son preference were deeply evolved, a genuine feature of human psychological architecture rather than a response to economic incentives, you would expect it to appear universally and to be resistant to change regardless of economic conditions. Neither is true. Son preference in modern populations correlates almost perfectly with economic conditions that historically rewarded sons. It is highest in societies with strong patrilineal inheritance, low female economic participation, and large family labor demands, conditions that directly mirror the agricultural incentive structure that produced son preference in the archaeological record. And it disappears rapidly when those conditions change. South Korea provides one of the most dramatic documented examples. In 1990, South Korea had one of the most extreme sex ratio imbalances at birth in the world, approximately 116 boys born for every 100 girls, driven by sex-selective abortion following the development of prenatal sex determination technology. This reflected a son preference so strong that families were willing to act on it medically. By 2007, the sex ratio had normalized to 106, close to the natural baseline. By 2010, some surveys showed daughter preference emerging among younger Korean parents. What changed between 1990 and 2007 was not Korean culture in some abstract sense. What changed was the economic position of women. As female education rates rose to match male rates, as women's labor market participation increased, as the economic return on daughters became comparable to sons, the son preference evaporated. In one generation, a preference that appeared to be culturally fundamental, backed by centuries of cultural reinforcement, religious tradition, and family pressure, dissolved within a single generation when the underlying economic incentives that produced it changed. This is the clearest possible evidence that son preference is not ancient. It is not evolutionary. It is a rational response to economic conditions, conditions that agriculture created, that industrial economies dissolved, and that hunter-gatherer societies never had. In the social system that built the human brain, the birth of a daughter was not a lesser event. In many documented cases, it was the greater one. The burial equality finding is real but requires careful interpretation. Absence of disparity in grave goods is not proof of emotional equality. It is absence of material disparity. The emotional experience of births of different sexes in prehistoric populations is not recoverable. The daughter as alliance argument, while supported by ethnographic data from surviving hunter-gatherer societies, involves inferring prehistoric behavior from modern traditional societies. The degree to which modern hunter-gatherers represent ancestral conditions is always an assumption. The agricultural causation argument is compelling, but correlation is not causation. Son preference and agriculture co-occur, but establishing that agriculture directly caused son preference rather than both being caused by some third factor requires careful analysis that ongoing research continues to refine. The South Korean data is real and well documented. The inference that it proves son preference is purely economic rather than partly biological requires the assumption that economic conditions can fully override any evolved preference, a claim that is plausible but not proven. What the combined evidence supports: son preference is not universal, not constant across time, and correlates specifically with economic conditions rather than with any documented feature of prehistoric life. So when did ancient humans celebrate the birth of a boy more than a girl? For most of human evolutionary history, the answer appears to be, they didn't, not systematically, not materially. The evidence from prehistoric burials and from surviving hunter-gatherer societies suggests that in the social system that shaped the human brain, a daughter's birth was not a lesser event. The son preference that has shaped so much of recorded human history is real. Its consequences, female infanticide, sex-selective abortion, the systematic devaluation of women's lives across civilizations, are documented and devastating. But it is not ancient. It is not natural. It is not a feature of the human psychology that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years on the African savanna. It emerged with agriculture, intensified with property inheritance, and as the South Korean data shows, dissolves within a generation when the economic conditions that produced it are removed. The preference was invented, it was not discovered. And what existed before it, the world in which a daughter was an alliance and a future and a bridge between peoples, that world was the default, not the exception. One question: did this change how you think about where son preference actually comes from, or did you already know it was economic rather than ancient? Drop it in the comments. This one is going to have an interesting range of responses. If this changed something like button. And if you want to keep following these origin stories, the real history underneath the things we assume are natural, subscribe. Next time, something that happens in your brain every single night. Why did ancient humans start having nightmares? And why yours are still about the same things theirs were? See you soon.